anonymity is dead, really. I struggle to see how anybody can really be using anonymous, I say with air quotes, donors now, because you're not anonymous. And even in the UK, where we've had it's been illegal to use anonymous donation for, well, nearly 20 years now. They're actually even thinking about removing it. We've got anonymity till 18, but because of the huge jump in commercial DNA testing, our regulatory body are considering removing anonymity at 18 because they can't promise it anymore to donors or families. So it just shows you how much has changed in quite a short period of time, and how I think DNA testing is incredible, and it's meant that I've been able to have a lot of questions answered for me, but it's also a little bit of a monster in the sense that I think it's growing so fast, the technology, and the fertility industry just hasn't caught up with it. It'd be interesting to see what's going to happen, I think, in the next sort of 5 to 10 years with all of that.
Welcome to Donor Conception Conversations. This is the one podcast that will provide research-based information, professional guidance, and personal experiences all about donor conception, from considering using a donor to parenting donor-conceived children. If it's about donor conception, we're going to talk about it. I'm your host, Lisa Schumann. I'm a researcher, a therapist, and an expert in donor conception. After decades of work in the field and working on site at some of the world's best fertility clinics, and through my group, the Center for Family Building, I've run workshops for donor-conceived children and have met with thousands of donors and recipients. I can share the truths and the tools that I've learned in all of my years of experience to help you get the information that you need to have a better path to parenthood and to tackle tough parenting issues. If it's about donor conception, we're here. So today I'm talking to Hayley Darknell-King. Hayley is joining us from the UK, where she's been kind enough to meet us in the evening, which I really appreciate. She's an advocate, a blogger, and a social media influencer. She not only understands the complexities of raising 2 donor-conceived children with her wife, but also understands these feelings deeply, as she is donor-conceived herself. I'm so glad to have her on today and hope to share her wisdom, her experience, and her thoughts with you so that you can get some help as well. Welcome, Hayley.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. So tell everyone a little bit about you and what you do and how you kind of got into this world.
Yeah, so I suppose the best place to start is probably near the beginning with maybe my parents' story, in a sense that I was born to a mum-dad family in the very early 80s after a long road my parents had with infertility. They were very fortunate and had one of the first sort of IVF at Bourne Hall Clinic in Cambridgeshire, UK, with Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards. And if anybody knows their IVF history, they were the first professors and doctors that were doing IVF technology at the time in the world. So my parents were very fortunate and were able to have 2 rounds with them, and they were successful on their second attempt. And I came along. So I knew this growing up. It was quite a celebrated story. But sadly, what I didn't know until a lot later in life, which I found out in 2015, was that they'd used an anonymous sperm donor as part of the treatment. So obviously that was like a late disclosure. So I found that out, like I say, only really 7 or 8 years ago now.
And how was that for you, Hayley?
I always sort of say it was like everything changed, but nothing changed in that moment. So a lot of late discovery donor conceived people, which is obviously what I am, it can come as quite a shock. I never anticipated to get that information, and I think by the time I was in my 30s, when I found out, you grow up knowing about certain narratives and what you think is your sort of genetic family history, whether that's medical or even like the stories that you're told as a child, like, oh, you got your blonde hair from this person in the family, or you might have this trait or interest or personality from great Auntie May or whoever it may be. And then to actually find the paternal line, in my case, was inaccurate in the sense of the genetics, was quite a shock. And it did kind of make me rethink a little bit about my identity. And of course, it didn't change that my dad was still my dad. Of course, he will always be my dad. But finding out that such pertinent information about my identity so late did have a real profound effect on me.
How would you describe that effect, or how you started to think about yourself differently?
It was more, like I say, just I had this one kind of story, if you like, from growing up, like your narrative about your identity. And then all of a sudden you start questioning, was that right? Some of it must be wrong. Even things like medical history. So I had some medical problems a few years ago. One of the first questions they ask is there any history of X, Y, and Z in the family? I unknowingly gave over the wrong medical history, and it actually impacted on some medical issues that I was having at the time. So it was all these other, like the knock-on effect of finding out late. And also, I think it makes you question things about your own parents. It caused a lot of problems and tensions within our family, obviously finding it out late in life. And I think my parents, even though, they raised me in a very different era to now, and I would never judge them by 2023 standards of ethics or whatever it is, because they were told to keep it a secret. But still, there's that issue of feeling like I was like that information that was really important to me was kept from me from, people that I love dearly, my parents. So it was all these things that kind of came to a head when I found out.
Mm-hmm. And so did that cause like a rift in your relationship, or do you feel like you were able to mend it, or what? How is that process for you of like kind of just digesting this information, new information, and then kind of recalibrating yourself as being a different sort of person in your family, not the person that you thought you were. You're now a different child, right? You're not genetically connected.
Yeah, I mean, and I did feel very sad. I think I went through loads of different emotions, probably every emotion you can think of, to disbelief, anger, upset, frustration, denial. There was some denial there, and I actually, we went and my dad and I did a straightforward paternity test just to check, because there were some ambiguities at the time due to the nature, it was such early treatment. I mean, and my parents weren't really told a lot by the doctors. They were, and certainly like even my dad, they treated my mum. They didn't really treat my dad, as in like now you go as a couple, if you're in a couple, you go to have fertility treatment as a couple because you're having a baby together. But back in the 70s and 80s, it was just, the birthing mum that was going to be going, and they had the treatment. So there wasn't really a lot of discussion with the doctors. So there was sort of an element of doubt there. So I suppose I went through all these sort of things, all these different emotions. But I think for all the difficulties that there were at the start, it did open up a lot of conversation with my parents. It's taken 8 years. I'm talking about this in a very sort of condensed manner. And you can imagine there was lots of conversations over those years, lots of difficult conversations. But ultimately, I feel like I'm actually closer to my parents now, having found out the truth, because I feel like we've been able to work through those issues together as a family. Now I'm doing things, I'm speaking out about my advocacy work. They're very supportive of that. And to me, that shows, that they are fully on board with, what I'm doing. And I can't ask for much more than that, really.
So you feel like the fact that your parents were supportive ultimately, even though initially you feel like they could have done things differently had they known, you feel like just the idea of them kind of joining you, supporting you, feeling like they want to help you in any way they can, resolve your struggles with it and be there for you, that's really been kind of a curative factor in helping you get more connected to them and feeling a little bit more resolved about the facts of this.
100%. Yes. And I think that support, especially in more recent years, has been invaluable, really. And it's just meant that I've been able to kind of move on. My parents have been able to move on. And I think it's the same with anything in life, really. If you, any struggles or challenges, you just want to know that the people that are closest to you are there supporting you in the best way possible. And even like with the situation, if anybody knows my story, but I actually DNA tested myself. So in 2019, I decided to DNA test myself, and that was a huge decision for me to make. And it made a huge difference knowing that my parents supported me in that. I was very worried about especially telling my dad, and I didn't want to upset him or think that I was looking for another father figure or anything like that, because that certainly wasn't what I was doing. But it was very important for me to find out this missing information that I felt that that was lacking now that I knew that the truth. And to have that support and, love from my parents was invaluable, because I think most people would always say that no matter how difficult life is or struggles that we may have, it's really important to have those that are closest to us supporting us. And like I say, to have that was like I say, invaluable.
It's fantastic. So, I think for a lot of people who are hearing this, Hayley, they worry, and I hear from patients all the time, particularly in those early years when they're first starting to disclose to their children. They always say, what if I mess up? What if I make a mistake? Or what if I say the wrong words? Or what if I don't share the right information? And, what I try to share with patients is that it's not a one-step process. You're going to be sharing this over time, and parents make mistakes, right? In life, right? We all make mistakes, and it's how we kind of rebound from those mistakes and try to mend, just like any relationship, mend those errors and fix things and try to share with our children how we're feeling, and just continually sharing our love for them and our support and our interest in what's important to them, right? Not just what's important to us, but what's important to them, showing that we care about what's important to them really can make a huge difference. And it sounds like that's similar to your experience.
Yes, 100%. I couldn't agree more with that. Depending on who's listening to this, I think it can work in different contexts. So if you have children that are older and donor conceived and you haven't told them, there's still time and there's still things that you can do to have those conversations in a loving and supportive way. Because sadly, we've got commercial DNA testing now, so people are finding out through other means. And that is a lot more traumatic, I would say, to find out by accident by doing a 23andMe kit or an Ancestry.com kit, as opposed to sitting down and talking to your children and saying, look, we need to have a chat about this. And you can do that. And there is help and resources obviously out there to try and facilitate that process. But also with our young children now that are donor conceived, I get it, because like I say, I've got children myself that are donor conceived with my wife. And I still worry, like, am I doing this right? Are they understanding? Or I think that that's just completely normal. And I think, like you say, just to have a bit of accountability. So if things maybe don't go to plan or we do make mistakes, which we're going to, it's like having accountability maybe for those mistakes, but also just being supportive and thinking, right, well, maybe this didn't work so well this time, but what can we do to make it better next time? Or, or how can we improve the conversation moving forward?
That's great. So tell us a little bit about that, Hayley. How have you thought about your children and their experiences, having had the insight personally of being donor conceived? Like, how do you think that changes how you approach their story or their lives and their understanding of their donor?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, like, my wife and I really started looking into this, I suppose, when our children were about 18 months, 2 years old. So starting to talk, and we were like, right, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to do this differently and better, and make things more open and not something to be ashamed of or avoid or put off? Because I think sometimes parents think, well, I don't really need to talk about that now. Our children are only young. We'll wait till they're teenagers, or we'll wait till they're older. Right. But really, from my personal reading that I've done on the topic, from speaking to lots of donor conceived people, professionals, we looked at children's storybooks, first of all. So books that explain our children's conception story. They were very, very helpful. And we just took it from there, really. And just as our children now are nearly 6, they're starting to ask us questions now about the process, as opposed to it being all parent-led. We are starting to almost get sort of questions coming back now from the children. And it's just nice to have, it's a conversation and a topic that I hope our children feel like they can bring up and ask us questions about, without being worried that they're going to upset, mammy and mama, like my wife and I.
So Hayley, you just cut out a little bit. So I just want to kind of repeat a little bit of what you said. So you were saying that, you felt that you really wanted to make sure that your children had the information from day one. And after all the research that you've done and with your own experiences, you have concluded that it makes the most sense to start right away. And you started with these storybooks and started talking to the kids. And as you're doing that, it sounds like your own experience of doing it has become more and more comfortable, right? It doesn't feel, even though in the beginning you felt like a little bit awkward, I want to get this right. As you talk about it more and more, it becomes more and more comfortable for you and just part of the family dynamic over time, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's just kind of bringing the conversation into everyday life. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a big sit down talk. It's just things that you can bring into conversation. So yeah, in our house, what we try to do is make sure that we kind of lean into our kids' curiosity about donor conception or the donor, as opposed to shying away from it. And the example I sort of give is that, especially like in LGBTQ families, or in my case with my wife and I, obviously there's no daddy in our household or family, and we've had it where the kids will say, well, you know, mummy, why haven't we got a daddy? Or where's our daddy, for example? And normally I think most people would turn around and say, well, we haven't got a daddy in our family. That would be the end of the conversation. But what we try to do is use that as a way to open up questions. So instead of just ending the conversation there, because it can be awkward and uncomfortable for parents to have that kind of question, you know, from a young child, but to actually say, well, you haven't got, we haven't got a daddy in our family, but because you've got two mummies, but have you got any questions about that? And just opening up the opportunity for our children to ask further questions, as opposed to shutting the conversation down. Because I think even when we shut down the conversation, sometimes, even if we don't mean to, I think our children can kind of pick up on that uncomfortableness, and that sort of maybe discomfort, I suppose, not uncomfortableness, discomfort. That I think children are quite good at picking up on that. And what we didn't want is our children to feel like they couldn't ask questions about their conception story, or about the donor, or anything really to do with that kind of topic. So that's what we've tried to do. And as our children are getting older, they're now, like I say, nearly 6, we're getting questions coming back to us now. So yeah,
like what
so
kind
like
of questions? What do you get?
they have a lot of questions about their siblings. So we're actually in touch with some of their donor siblings. So that's other families that have used the same donor that we have. So we have a lot of questions about them, and they ask to speak to them every now and again. Like, so we'll send, they're all very similar ages, but we'll show them photos or send a message to one of the families, or we'll arrange a quick Zoom call or whatever it is. So we get questions like that. They ask about the donor. So they'll say, so we use lots of different words to refer to him too. So we used an open ID donor. So we don't have identifying information. Potentially, obviously, if our children want that when they're older, they can apply formally through the UK HFEA, which is a regulatory body here. They can apply for that information when they turn 18. But we have an extensive profile. We have photographs. We have a huge personality assessment, lots of things that he's obviously interested in that he's noted down on his profile. And we talk to the children about that. So they may say, what's the donor interested in? He's written down that he likes this, and this is his favorite color, and all these kinds of things. And it's just, and I hope our intention is that they feel like that they can talk about it, and they don't have to hide that curiosity because they don't want to upset us. Is there two mums, that we're not going to get overly, just like upset or think of it as a topic that is like a forbidden taboo within the family. You can't talk about the donor type thing. So,
and for those of you who are listening, I'm sorry Hayley is kind of going in and out, but it's so, her words of wisdom are so valuable. It's really worth hanging in here because, sorry about the connection, but it's really great, all of these things that she's sharing with us. As you can see, it's so valuable to be able to have this open dialogue. And it sounds like, Hayley, what you're saying now is that, those initial conversations that maybe in the beginning you felt a little uncomfortable discussing are now kind of a free-flowing conversation. It just becomes easy to talk about it.
Yes, and I think that's the aim. I'm sure things will change as the children get older, and like any children will have the teenage years and all of that to deal with. But hopefully this, the open environment will continue as they get older.
That's great. It's fantastic. And hopefully it's encouraging for everybody listening that this is something that an experience that you can have, that, once you open the dialogue, this could just be a free-flowing conversation and it just becomes very comfortable. How about for you, Hayley? Because I know that you also reached out to your genetic family. And how was that experience for you? And do you feel that was helpful for you? And how did you go from feeling kind of awkward about it, or that it was difficult, to a place where, like you're saying with your kids, where it became much more easy and free flowing?
It was difficult at the start. I think initially I just wanted to find out some basic information, mainly on my genetic father. So I was able, through ancestry.com and extensive genealogy work, to actually find him. And obviously he was previously anonymous, so there was, no information. Although he did say that he'd always wondered about his donations and any children that would have resulted. I don't, to actually have me show up was quite a shock, I think. So
Sure.
there was lots of things to navigate, I think. And essentially, I'm doing that quite, I'm 40 now. So I was doing that sort of in my late 30s. He's in his 60s. So I suppose it's kind of like, it was uncharted territory. I had no real support or guidance how to manage those sort of connections. And I would say the same with my siblings as well. So I obviously matched with some of my own donor siblings through Ancestry and 23andMe and the various commercial sites. So, and it's challenging. And I would say that it's challenging doing so late in life, because I think the other issue is that, like Jonathan, my genetic father, he, like I say, it was almost like he's never been able to prepare for those conversations, because I don't think he ever knew whether they would happen. Whereas now, it's why I'm very big advocating that donors get educated, because there is a very strong chance, even if they go down as anonymous, that they will be located through commercial DNA testing, even if themselves aren't on the sites. It only takes a relative of theirs to be on the site to find them.
Right.
And I think that's why I feel very strongly that, we can learn a lot from the years gone by, because I was very fortunate in that Jonathan was very receptive to contact. But a lot of people of my generation had a very negative reaction because they were promised anonymity, the donors. Yeah, I think, like I say, we can learn a lot. And I like to think now that donors are being very, very much educated, or, they should be educated about contact later on down the line with any children or then adults that are born from their donations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is difficult because there are so many donors who are still kind of considered anonymous, even though they're not anonymous. And so those donors, we don't know if they've been counseled properly, and we don't know, even if they have been counseled properly, if they really can kind of see it, right? When you're young, I mean, I've counseled so many donors in my life, and it's very hard sometimes to tell a young person to think ahead, 20 years from now, and what is your life going to be like? And they say, oh yeah, it's fine. I remember when I was 20 years old, I probably would have just thought, okay, where am I going on vacation with my friends? I don't want to think about this, right? It's very hard to kind of wrap your mind around the gravity of, there are going to be these human beings in 15, 20 years who are going to come and want to talk to you. And you might be, married with kids of your own. You might be wanting to travel the world. You might be, in all different places in your life. And all of a sudden you're kind of faced with the gravity of all of these people and all of their feelings and all of their families. And I'm sure it's a lot. I'm sure Jonathan had to deal with a lot of those feelings.
Yeah. And like I say, I've been, like I say, very fortunate with Jonathan. He's been very welcoming. And we have a good relationship. We've stayed in touch. I don't see him as a father figure. He's more like a friend or an uncle, kind of, I suppose, really. But it has been very helpful to meet him and see him, and we look very alike. I always say, I always say it was like looking at a familiar stranger. But like I say, been more discussion within the communities and within clinics and banks about anonymity is dead. Really, I struggle to see how anybody can really be using anonymous. I say with air quotes donors now, because you're not anonymous. And even in the UK, where we've had it's been illegal to use anonymous donation for, nearly 20 years now. They're actually even thinking about removing it. We've got anonymity till 18, but because of the huge jump in commercial DNA testing, our regulatory body are considering removing anonymity at 18 because they can't promise it anymore to donors or families. So it just shows you how much has changed in quite a short period of time, and how I think DNA testing is incredible, and it's meant that I've been able to have a lot of questions answered for me. but it's also a little bit of a monster in the sense that I think it's growing so fast, the technology, and the fertility industry just hasn't caught up with it. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what's going to happen, I think, in the next sort of 5 to 10 years with all of that.
Yeah. And how did you feel, Hayley? Were you nervous to meet Jonathan? Were you anxious to meet your donor-related siblings? And how did you kind of decide, okay, I'm going to do this? And what was going through your head?
I was very nervous to meet Jonathan. It was kind of exciting, nervous, loads of different like feelings all at once, really. It was, like I say, the actual search was quite exhilarating at times, which sounds a bit strange, but it was, very like actually doing all the research behind it and looking at family tree history. And I think that's probably down to my personality as well, because I am quite an inquisitive to meet him. And the same with my siblings, that was difficult with them. I've not actually met them in person yet. I've only had communication virtually, so on the phone and Zoom calls, but we're hoping to meet up properly this year, fingers crossed.
And how have they gone? How have they been so far, the Zoom calls with the genetic siblings? Did they know about you, or had they not found out about you? How did that happen?
So we all matched because I was born in an era where there was no records. So the only way that we did match was through the DNA sites. And out of the 4 of us, so I went into DNA testing knowing that I was donor conceived. And so did one of my brothers. He knew from quite a young age, but 2 of my other siblings actually had no idea they were donor conceived until they tested and matched with, obviously, because by this point, Jonathan is actually on Ancestry now. So he's actually gone on there to confirm the connection. But obviously by him being on there, when the siblings have gone on, obviously they've come up, and it's very overt because they are matched directly with him and with me. It's been very, very difficult for those siblings because they've essentially found out the information from doing a DNA test. They had no idea prior to testing, which is a really sad thing that's happened. And I know it's been a long road for them having to process everything.
And you probably see a variety of difference in the experiences of how their parents are handling it, right?
Yes. I don't know a great deal of their individual circumstances with their parents, but I think that finding out in a DNA test, like I touched on earlier, it's probably one of the worst ways to find out. And I do know lots of donor conceived people within the community have found out, even sadly, after their parents have passed away. So they found this information out and they haven't even got anybody to ask. Their parents aren't around anymore to ask the questions. And that must be really, really hard. And that's why I'm such a big supporter and advocate, if you like, of, you're never too old to tell your kid, even if you're listening to this and you've got children that are a lot older, there's still time to have those conversations. And for whatever, just don't let them find out by taking a 23andMe kit. I just think it's the worst way to find out.
Right. It's never too young, but it's never too late.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
We talk to different people, aren't we, in that sense? Because I find like people come to speak to me that are like all different ages and different situations. And it's right from people that are starting to think about having a family and with donor conception and the things that they maybe want, the things that they'd like to ask their egg and sperm banks and ask my opinion on that, all the way up to adults that are older than me that have found out they're donor conceived and then ask me about the situation and support and stuff. And there's I think because we've gone through the decades of different regulation and different attitudes towards donor conception, we're having all these different experiences, aren't we? And it's just try and help a range of people that have gone through lots of different situations, depending on, like you say, when they were born, the type of family that they were born into, and all this kind of stuff. But it's been great to see how much donor conception has moved forward, I think, in the last sort of few years, certainly. And like I say, I just hope that continues.
Yes, I hope so too. And where you are in the UK, there's much more openness, right? You have a national registry. We have no national registry in the US, even though some states have been trying to enact legislation to regulate donation. It's really not possible because there's no governing body that's going to pay for this. So unfortunately, we don't have anything like that. And I think there is a trickle-down effect, right? If the government and if the clinics and if the banks and everyone is not able to do this, I think there is this message that it's not necessary. And so I think it's really hard for people who are just broaching donor conception to wrap their mind around how important it is to disclose early, if possible, as early as you can, and really to help your children feel comfortable and not to be afraid of it. As you're saying, Hayley, you really treasure your relationship with your parents, and you're grateful that they were open with you. And in spite of the fact that you learned late and you learned in a way that's really, difficult, your parents were able to repair the relationship with you by just being close to you and being available to you, right? And it sounds like you're saying the same thing with Jonathan, your donor, that his openness was really helpful to you.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I've been fortunate in that sense because, I have had that support from both sides, if you like, which has made things, easier. And it would be nice to think that everybody has that, but sadly they don't. So, that's why I think it's so important to have these conversations and to keep having these conversations. And like you say, you touched on the sort of the lack of regulation in the US, which I think is highly problematic, but I can understand because you've got all the different states, you've got all the different, obviously.
Yeah, it's difficult.
You've got massive sperm and egg banks and all the rest of it, and each area has their own rules. But I think it's starting to happen is that now people are talking about it, parents becoming more educated about the different options. So, and maybe what's in the best interest of the child, and providing themselves with options, So even looking at things like obviously known donation and how that can work, and a lot more practitioners and therapists are becoming more knowledgeable about how known donation can work and the things that need to be worked through before and everything like that. My hope is that as the conversations shift and parents become more educated, they will almost kind of force the banks and the clinics and the fertility industry into kind of making what I would consider more ethical decisions about how they run their, and how, for example, how many family units are created from one donor. In the US, there is no limit whatsoever. So not to frighten people, but you potentially, we know of documented cases where there are sibling groups of, 200, 300, 400 children from one donor. And in my opinion, that's unacceptable. But because there is no regulation, there is nothing to control that. But what I would like to think is going to happen is that parents and other, professionals like yourself and things start speaking up a little bit more about what is in the best interest of the child and the family, the donor conceived family.
Well, just a couple of things about that, Hayley, and you went out a little bit, so I just want to reiterate what you said. We were talking about this idea of regulating for sperm banks, let's say, for example, to regulate the numbers, and maybe also to be able to help them, understand how important it is to kind of keep those numbers reasonable. But, the problem is that I think that my experience professionally is working with these banks and agencies. They tell, and clinics, they do tell the donors, you're only supposed to donate a number of times. And the donors say, I agree. And sometimes they leave the sperm bank or the egg bank or wherever and say, yes, I'm finished. I'm never going to donate again. And so I think that the egg bank or the sperm bank or the clinic is doing all they can in that moment to try to contain it, but they can't determine if someone is going to go donate to their friend on Facebook or go to another sperm bank or another. There's no way to know. So that's the first thing. And also, this whole business about, I just want to kind of, since I have the opportunity to bust this myth a little bit about getting medical records. And it's really not possible for two reasons. Number one, it's not possible, at least in the US, to search someone's medical records completely. You can't, it's not possible, and really a waste of time and energy for everybody to be fighting for this, to try to find every medical record anybody's ever had. I've had many patients in my therapy practice for many, many years. Nobody will ever know that they were in my practice because of our HIPAA compliance laws. And so it's not possible to find every hospitalization and therapist that your donors had. And secondly, so that's, I think kind of useless. And also, a person who has committed a crime will not be registered unless they're convicted. So you could have somebody who's murdered people, who's a pedophile, whatever, unless they've actually been convicted of that crime, there's no record of their arrest. So we would not know. So I think that, there's been a lot of energy spent on this. And unfortunately, I don't really think it's going to be fruitful. I think what we really need is to make sure everybody has psychological screening, which up until recently, many donors did not have. And so that really could help us tremendously. And I know certainly from the adoption world, we have no way to screen birth mothers or birth fathers. We don't do any genetic screening. We don't do psychological screening. And certainly you have no control over what happens in utero. With donor conception, you have control over what happens in utero. And you also have this wonderful ability to do psychological screening and testing. So that's just my 2 cents for the day about that whole issue. I hope that everyone thinks about that. With regard to this issue of donor conceived siblings, I was just speaking with Wendy Kramer, who runs the donor sibling registry, and she said that some people are trying to kind of put, and I know there's no positive spin you can put on 400 siblings, but they're trying to put as positive a spin as they can on it and say, okay, I have all these siblings. I thought I was an only child, but now I have all these great people that I can be friends with. And so that's going to be a really nice thing for me. And I guess that's, all we have at this moment until we can regulate the industry. All we really have is the opportunity to reach out to donor-related siblings and hope to develop nice relationships with them. We can't guarantee that we're going to like everybody we find, but maybe we will find some people that we like and that we enjoy spending time with. And hopefully that can be a nice gift to give your children, that opportunity to meet with other donor-related siblings. I know personally, I always wanted different siblings myself. So lots of people want different brothers or sisters than they have anyway, right?
Yeah, no, I think obviously the donor sibling registry has been running a long time now, and that is obviously a good, resource for people to connect. But like going back to the clinics, I think if we're really honest, the clinics and the banks have been greedy and, very profit driven. If they wanted to enforce stricter family limits, they could. I've had chats with big banks in Europe, had some very honest conversations, and a lot of the time, like I say, it does come down to money. So I think these conversations are really good to have, because I don't think in 2023 we should be actively in a situation where people, human beings are being created, like I say, on a production line where we're up, 200 siblings. Yes, it's great having met my own having met them online, my own siblings, and we're connected with my own children's siblings. I think there's a difference between maybe having 10 to 20 siblings to 200 siblings.
Absolutely.
But I think what I'm saying is banks can and should be doing more to restrict that. And they can. And, they're in control of how many vials of sperm they sell. But yes, they might not be able to control where the donor goes, and I understand that. But they, at an individual level, can control how many vials of sperm they send out. They can control what types of testing they do so they can do genetic testing. I understand they can't necessarily get full medical history, but they can go back to the donor and check in 5 years' time for renewed history. Because what we're finding is a lot of the banks are taking a snapshot history of a donor, say at 18, and never following up with that donor. And as we all know, we all get old and have different ailments. Things come up in our family history. And I think, yes, we maybe can't retrospectively go back and get medical records as such. And I understand maybe the complications with doing that, but banks could be looking to get information, like I say, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, but they don't, because they haven't either got the systems to do that because they haven't invested in it, or they've chosen not to. And like I say, I think parents are becoming more aware, because there are banks that are doing these things, and they're doing things, in my opinion, better than others. And like I say, I hope that the word gets out and that more parents will start, they'll start using banks and clinics that are doing these things that others have, aren't doing or choose not to do.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I think that goes back to this idea of openness, Hayley, because, the research that was just recently presented at ASRM was that, even though sperm and egg banks do have in their contracts with donors, they agree, the donors agree to reach back out to the sperm banks or the egg banks if they have changes in medical history. This recent survey with egg donors, when they said, you signed this contract saying that you were going to reach back out if you had a change in your medical history. Have you had a change in your medical history, and did you report it? And they said, yes, I've had a change in my medical history, and no, I have not reported it.
Right.
So that's really tough because people rely on thinking that's going to happen, right? Because they look at the contract and they say, well, the donor said they're going to report it if they have a change in the medical history, and they're not reporting it. And so again, if we kind of have more openness, then we can be in touch, right? And then you can know, right, if your donor's 25 and she's doing great and there's no health problems whatsoever, but let's say 35, she has breast cancer. Well, you want to be able to maybe get early mammogram screenings for your daughter. And so if you are in touch with your donor, then you know what's going on in her life, right? And so,
yeah,
I think that would solve a lot of problems. Just being able to have some openness.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a great point, Lisa. And it's interesting how that shift for openness is now, like I say, we're moving towards that more. And I know in maybe sort of within egg donation, it's more common as well, maybe in the sense that it certainly is over here, where it is facilitated sometimes contact pre-18, not so much with sperm donors, but it can be with egg donors. And like I say, the HFEA are looking to even have an option to have a donor, but facilitated through a clinic, but open ID from birth, actually formally done that way. And that is one of the things they are considering. How it be implemented in practice, I don't know. The concept of openness is shifting everything really in relation to donor conception.
Yeah. Well, I certainly know just in my own experience, like with my daughter, she didn't have her first tooth until she was 2 years old, which is odd, right? I mean, you usually have your first tooth at 6 months. And we didn't know what was wrong with her. And we were so worried. And we went to the pediatrician. He kept on saying, let's wait. And then he said, it could be a number of things. Maybe we should have her go to, a pediatric dentist, and maybe we should have her have some x-rays. Maybe we even need to investigate if there's something wrong in the x-ray. We might have to do some surgery to see, and maybe we should do some blood work. So I thought, my children were adopted. I know their birth parents. I called the birth mom on the phone and I said, could you tell me about your teeth? Did you get your teeth late in life? And she said, yeah, I was older than 2 years old when I had my first tooth. And I thought, there you go. So we didn't have, not that, this was not cancer, and it's a small issue, but I didn't have to go through all this testing for my daughter because I could just easily pick up the phone and call the birth mom and say, tell me about your teeth. When did you get your teeth when you were growing? So that's like a really nice thing to have. And unfortunately, we don't have these opportunities in donor conception yet.
Like I say, obviously adoption is very different, but we can learn a lot, I think, from the adoption community and maybe how things have evolved there with like open records and things. And like I say, it will be really interesting time now, certainly in the UK, as we move into sort of the next phase of what they're going to do really and how they're going to manage it. Because like I say, the anonymity thing is questionable. It certainly doesn't really exist. And I think that's what the people that make the laws over here are looking at. The laws that we have, they argue that they're not fit for purpose anymore. But also, are they fit for purpose really for how, like you say, like when you want that information, it would be nice to have some way to get that information and things like that. And even like my wife and I, we used an open ID donor, and we did consider a known donor, but we didn't really give it as much thought as maybe we should have done. And it's only after I met my own genetic father, if you like, and sort of looked a little bit into the future with our own children. And it does make you see things in a different way. I would never sit and say to somebody, you should do X, Y, and Z to build your family. But I'm really passionate about people making informed choices and people having all of that information in front of them. What are my options? what are the things I need to consider, and and almost, like you say, project a little bit into the future to try and think what things that might come up in the future and how maybe you can tackle that, right at the start, or change something about your journey path to make sure that you're best equipped for what's coming, I suppose. So
yeah, and of course, now that you have some open ID donors, you do have this possibility that your donors, and I don't know what your donor is going to be like when you finally reach out to him, but at one point in their life they said, yes, I would be open to meeting or open to some kind of connection. So even though there's no guarantee, at least they once said it. Whereas if the donor said they want to be anonymous, even though they can't be, it could be tough on our kids because we don't know what they're going to find, if that person is going to be welcoming or not, because they said they didn't want to be contacted, right? So you may have a bunch of donors who don't want any contact.
Yeah. And some donors, I think, if they've given a donation anonymously and that's what they've been told, that they're going to be anonymous, they might not have ever donated in the first place if they knew, that they were then going to have a knock at the door in 18 years' time. And that says a lot, doesn't it? And I think really we need to be looking at, the donors, like you say, and making sure that they're aware that, like you say, anonymity is impossible to guarantee, now and moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place for us to end for today, but I feel like I could sit here with you, Hayley, all day long and ask you a million questions and talk to you about so many things. My mind's buzzing. So I hope you'll come back and do this again and answer some more questions for us.
Oh, thank you for having me on. Like I say,
hopefully next time we'll have better connection. You were frozen for a second, but hopefully our audience is going to be able to be patient, because this is really important information. So, and Hayley's a gem. Can you tell us where we can reach you and how people can reach out to you, and if there's anything that you want to share in any parting words?
Yeah, so if you're into your Instagram, you can find me at DCP Journey to RP, which I didn't think too hard about that title when I set it up. So DCP Journey to RP, which essentially means donor conceived person's journey to a recipient parent. So that's my handle on Instagram. Or more recently, I've just set up my website. So it's allthingsdonorconception.com. So allthingsdonorconception.com. You can find me there. And you'll have links to my socials and things like that. I'm hoping to kind of have, like say, that the website where I can post more long form blog posts, signposting for different, whether you're a parent or a donor conceived person or professional. And more recently, I've just taken up a role as director of the LGBTQ arm of an organization called Path to Parent Hub, which is a great online platform to support parents that are either thinking of donor conception or parenting their donor conceived children. So you can find me there too. So
great.
Hopefully one of those, if you search that, you'll come
okay.
Any questions, you can always, like I say, I always welcome questions. Like I say, you can either find my emails on one of those sites or just connect with me over Instagram in Messenger.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Hayley. You're fantastic. And for everybody who's listening, thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time and for listening. Please subscribe, and that's how we can keep going. Rate and review. And of course, you can always reach out to us on familybuilding.net, which is our website. And we would love to have you look around, join our newsletter, and just be part of our community. Love to have you. So thank you for joining today. And I'll see you next time. Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you.